Hey there! Welcome everyone to Old Hickory and Bickory, the podcast where we will have the most intriguing talks specifically about Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson, I mean, and where the name Old Hickory even came from. My name is Brielle Malone and I will be your host, and today we'll be highlighting, was Andrew Jackson a champion of democracy and the common man, or was he a tyrant who abused his power? To help keep me on my toes, I have 6 fantastic guest speakers who will be throwing some questions my way. We have
Kyle,
Bella,
Frankie,
Alyssa,
Evan,
and
Abby.
Before we get started, I would like to give a shout out to Instagram for sponsoring this podcast. If Andrew had Instagram, I just know someone would comment, "You can't just ignore the Supreme Court like that," and he'd be like, "Weird, didn't see that ruling, must have been shadow banned." Hashtag Trail of Fears. Classic Andrew. So some background on Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson was the 7th U.S. President, born March 15th, 1776, and died June 18th, 1884. His temperament was usually a bit poor and was hot-headed and sensitive to insult. In fact, the way he would fight disputes was in literal duels, and 103 of them. In one of them, he actually killed a man, Charles Dickinson. Hickory is one of the world's hardest woods, which is really strong. And from Jackson's amount of stubbornness, that's why he got the nickname Old Hickory. Alright, looks like the first special guest speaker will be Kyle. Ready to challenge me?
absolutely. So Jackson was often called a champion of the common man. Why did he gain so much support from the everyday American?
Great question. Jackson wasn't from an elite background like previous presidents. He was a self-made man, a war hero, and someone who understood frontier life. He believed in expanding political participation, and one of his biggest moves was pushing for universal white male suffrage. Before Jackson, voting was mostly limited to property owners, but under his leadership, more states removed property requirements, allowing more working-class white men to vote. That made him the guy for the common man, well, at least if you were white.
So he was expanding for democracy, but only for certain people?
Exactly. If you were black, Native American, or a political opponent, Jackson wasn't on your side. His vision of democracy was very much for the people, but only his people.
Yikes!
I know, right? Moving on, let's switch over to our next guest speaker. Next up, we have Bella.
I have some questions about the National Bank. Jackson fought hard against it, saying it was corrupt and benefited the elite. Do you think it was really for the people, or was it just consolidating its power?
Jackson had believed that the national bank had more favor towards the elite and wealthy rather than the everyday worker. He vetoed its renewal and basically tried to say, "I'm shutting this down for the people." His supporters loved it, especially because they believed that he was standing up against corruption. In Webster's response to Jackson's veto of the national bank, Jackson says, "It manifestly seeks to inflame the poor against the rich. It wantonly attacks the whole classes of people for the purposes of turning against them the prejudices and resentments of the other classes." But Jackson, let's be real. While he claimed he was helping the people, his actions created a financial mess. He didn't just kill the bank. He pulled federal money and placed it in state banks, many of which were run by his political allies. These banks started reckless lending, leading to inflation and eventually contributing to the Panic of 1837. So did he mean to help the people? Maybe. Did it actually help? Not so much.
So a win in theory, but a disaster in execution?
You've got it. His intention might have been originally good, but he definitely wasn't thinking about the potential consequences. Thanks, Bella. Our third guest speaker is Frankie. Hey, Frankie, what's your question?
one of Jackson's most infamous decisions was the Indian Removal Act, right? Could you walk us through what happened and how it shaped his legacy?
Right. The Indian Removal Act was a really sad and terrible event, trying to promote his people but kicking out the rest. Let me explain. The Indian Removal Act, which was led by Andrew Jackson, ended up kicking tons of Native Americans out of their land so that the white men could live on theirs. They pushed them to move far away during a brutal winter season, causing about 1/3 of the Native American population to die. Originally, the Cherokee Nation actually took their case to the Supreme Court and won. The court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that they had a right to stay on their land. Jackson had completely ignored this and sent troops to force them out anyway, and the result led to a trail of tears. In the document Natives' response to Congress about their removal, it says, "But if we are compelled to leave our country, we see nothing but ruin before us. The country west of the Arkansas Territory is unknown to us. The far greater part of the region is, beyond all controversy, badly supplied with food and water, and no Indian tribe live as agriculturous with all these articles. All our neighbors would speak a language totally different from ours and practice different customs. It contains neither the scenes of our childhood nor the graves of our fathers." What surprises me the most is that Jackson was aware of this and pushed down the tribes and the Supreme Court anyway.
Wow, so he just flat out ignored the Supreme Court?
Pretty much. Whether the Supreme Court accepted or denied it, he would have pushed for it anyway. Talk about being an old hickory there. What an interesting topic. Thanks for tuning in. Let's move on to our next guest. Alyssa, what's up?
In history class, it's clear that Jackson was known for using his presidential power aggressively. Do you think he strengthened the presidency, or did he take it too far?
Oh, he definitely expanded presidential power. Before Jackson, Congress was the dominant force in government, but Jackson believed the president should be the most powerful figure and acted on that belief. First, he used the veto more than any previous president. Basically, anytime Congress passed something he didn't like, he shut it down immediately. Second, he ignored Supreme Court rulings, like we just talked about. And third, he introduced the spoil system, where he replaced government officials with his loyal supporters. It was all about loyalty over qualifications for him. At first, his spoil system could have won him some quote-unquote points. However, it actually led to an even bigger problem. In the document Congress response to Jackson's spoil system, it quotes, "One bit of advice Van Buren offered concerned the appointment of the collector of the Port of New York. When Van Buren learned that Jackson intended to appoint Samuel Swartwout to the office, he almost collapsed. Van Buren alerted the president immediately. Unfortunately, Jackson refused to listen. He liked Swartwout because he had been an early supporter, and so he went ahead with the appointment. In time, of course, Swartwout absconded with $1,222,705.09. It was a monumental theft. Jackson was mortified. This event made Jackson look like a big public embarrassment. He had truly thought that he could trust all of his supporters based on solely the fact that they supported him."
So he made the presidency stronger, but he also made it more personal?
Exactly. He turned the office into something more like a personal power tool rather than just a government position. Some of his supporters favored his strong leadership, but others feared it was veering into dictatorship. Thanks for stopping by, Alyssa. Our next guest speaker will be Evan. Hey, what's up?
Hey, so we talked about the National Bank, but I'm curious about what happened after that. You know, the Panic of 1837.
Oh, absolutely. This is where we see how Jackson's war against the bank didn't just hurt the elites, but also the very common man he claimed to protect. So, as mentioned before, while Jackson killed the National Bank, he moved federal money into smaller state banks, and these banks started lending recklessly, printing more money than they could back up, and causing massive inflation. And so what Jackson did to try and fix this was he issued the Specie Circular in 1836, which said that people could only buy land with gold or silver instead of paper money. And so, as you can expect, most people didn't have gold or silver just lying around. So land sales dropped, banks collapsed, businesses shut down, and unemployment skyrocketed. But here's the kicker. This all hit after Jackson left office. So it was Martin Van Buren, his hand-picked successor, who had to deal with the fallout.
So Jackson caused the mess, but Van Buren took the blame?
Pretty much. Jackson got to walk away as a strong man who took down the bank, while Van Buren was left dealing with one of the worst economic crises in U.S. history. And since Van Buren didn't handle it well, Jackson's opponents used the disaster to tear down his whole legacy.
So the champion of the common man causes economic collapse that devastated the common man?
Yep, another case of Jackson sounding like he was helping, but in reality, not so much. Thank you, Evan, for joining us. Looks like Abby is ready to go up.
So, Brielle, after everything we covered, was Jackson a hero of democracy or a power-hungry tyrant?
The main question of why we're here today. Honestly, I say both, and I think many historians would agree with me on this. He expanded voting rights, took on corrupt institutions, and changed the presidency forever. However, he had also abused his powers, wrecked native communities, and set dangerous precedents. He's a classic case of flawed but influential.
So possibly more villain than hero.
It's quite hard to say. It really depends on how you view it. You could look at the pros and think he's great. You could look at the cons and say he's bad. You could look at his own personality and say he's courageous and strong-willed or mean and stubborn. Love him or hate him, he's one of the most consequential presidents in U.S. history. He's quite the complex person, and there's no wrong or right way to view him, really. However, if you want my own personal opinion, I do believe he abused his power, but I wouldn't go as far to say he was a tyrant, but he did make a lot of mistakes. Well, there you have it, folks. Thank you for chatting with me, everyone. This podcast would not have been made without my guests and our sponsor, so thank you so much to them. Don't forget to subscribe to Old Hickory and Bickory for more history deep dives. This was on Old Hickory, but our next podcast will be involved with Young Hickory, his own mini